이번에 제가 인터뷰를 한 분은 김용 총재님입니다. 김용 총재님은 미국의 아이비리그 대학인 다르트머스 대학의 전 총장님이기도 하고 또 월드뱅크, 세계은행의 전 총재를 역임하신 분이죠. 김용 총재님과 얘기를 나누던 중에 이 월드뱅크와 한국의 인연에 대한 흥미로운 얘기를 듣게 됐어요. Hi, Dr. Jim. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sungyeon. I'm very, very happy to be here with you.
Can I call you Dr. Jim?
You can call me whatever you want.
Okay. There was a point in my life where I found something out about the world, which made me proud and sad at the same time. So I pulled up a list of like 20 richest countries in the world, and I realized that almost every single one of them were already rich, imperial powers, at least by the early 20th century. And the only exception to this rule was South Korea.
Right. Very interesting footnote is I was born in 1959. Mm-hmm. And in 1959, the World Bank decided that Korea was too poor to get a World Bank loan. Now, at that time, just about every country could get a World Bank loan. But the World Bank decided in its great wisdom at the time that Korea was too rural. The education level was too low. There was no industry because all the industry was in the north. And so Korea, south of the 38th parallel, was ineligible until 1963.
Wow. But isn't that the World Bank's job to precisely loan to countries that are in the situation that South Korea was back in the 1950s?
Well, there were a lot of countries in Africa who also could not get a loan, mm-hmm. and so there were a bunch of them. But my vice president for East Asia, mm-hmm. in like the first week that I started the job, he put this whole packet of materials on Korea on my desk, and he wrote a little note saying, "Funny how wrong we get it sometimes." Right?
Wow.
And their conclusion was Korea's going to need direct aid for a very long time. The idea of getting a loan and then being able to pay it back, they thought that was really beyond Korea.
Oh, okay. So because we won't be able to pay the money back, the way that Koreans should be getting money at the time was by direct aid.
They were saying that Korea needed grants. Right?
Okay.
So, I mean, this was the great irony in terms of just, the span of my life, that I started off in a country that was too poor to get a World Bank loan and then became president. And this great irony was not lost on anybody.
Wow.
Yeah. For example, when I was campaigning for the job, I went to Ethiopia. And the legendary Prime Minister Meles was one of the people I met. And when I sat down with him, he looked at me and he said, "Tell me about Semaul Undong." Mm-hmm. And I thought, what does this guy know about Semaul Undong? But it turns out that he had made all of his cabinet members read about the Korean development story. Mm-hmm. And his reasoning was, if you look around at the countries that have succeeded, because, Japan had very high literacy levels, more than 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. China is just so big mm-hmm. that they didn't think that they could follow the example of China. But Ethiopia specifically, but also lots of countries in Africa asked me, wow, how did Korea do it? Mm-hmm. Can we get some of that magic and do it ourselves? Mm-hmm. So Korea really is a model.
I understand that World Bank is an institution that was founded to turn poor countries into rich ones. Is that right?
Originally it was founded to rebuild Europe. So in 1944, it was a time when it looked like the war might end at some point. And so representatives of 45 countries went to this literally ski resort in New Hampshire, in Bretton Woods. And they invented two institutions. One was the World Bank. At the time, it was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And the other was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank was supposed to be named the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it was the bank that was going to rebuild a destroyed Europe at that time. Mm-hmm. Right? What happened at the time was General George Marshall started the Marshall Plan, mm-hmm. and the Marshall Plan was the U.S.'s model for rebuilding Europe, and they spent a huge amount of money to do that. So then the so-called International Bank for Reconstruction and Development had to step back and say, all right, so what do we do now? The Marshall Plan is going to rebuild Europe. What's our role? The very first loan from the World Bank went to France. Mm-hmm. But then after that, they really started thinking, maybe we should focus on poor countries. Mm-hmm. And they did.
And because Korea achieved this rags to rich story in a very short period of time, Koreans have in their mind that it's almost a preordained destiny for every country in the world to rise at some point. But if I look at the list of countries and their respective per capita GDP, countries that were poor at the end of World War II are by and large still very poor. Maybe a couple of exceptions I saw were countries like Singapore or UAE, but among countries with a significant population, like more than 10 million, South Korea was probably like the only success case where a country that was extremely poor after World War II rose to have a comparable lifestyle as countries that were already developed in the early 20th century. So, I'm sure you've studied this in detail when you were at World Bank. Some countries like South Korea or Singapore, were they able to pull themselves out of poverty where most other countries were not able to?
First, let me start by saying that things have gotten a lot better. For example, it used to be that in Africa, not very many children made it to their 5th birthday. It used to be that many people died of malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, and life was absolutely miserable. So if you look at things like just basic indicators, there's a lot of good evidence that things have gotten better. But you're right, in terms of the top 20, only Korea. But as I looked back at the history, I actually read a lot of the economic development textbooks. And at first, many of the leading development economists were in agreement with the World Bank. They said, Korea is just not our best candidate for development. Philippines is. And the reasoning was, at the time it was called modernization theory. In the 1960s and 70s, really mostly in the 60s, by the 70s there was good evidence that Korea was growing. Korea was too Confucian to grow. They didn't have enough Western influence. They didn't have enough Western cultural values. And so this is why they said Philippines, on the other hand, is a very Catholic country. They've had Western exposure for a long time. So we think the Philippines will grow quickly. Well, of course, that's exactly the opposite of what did happen.
And by the time I arrived in the US, they were saying exactly the opposite.
Yes.
Saying that Japan and Korea developed because they had the Confucian values, and other countries that didn't develop, it's because they didn't have Confucian values or something similar.
So unfortunately, a lot of this theorizing about what makes countries rich or poor, everyone has what my father used to call ketong charak, right? They all have their own ideas about why one country grew or another country didn't grow. And things change over time. So, the history of development economics is so interesting. So for a long time, they said modernization is key, exposure to Western institutions, accepting Western ideals, which of course is in many ways just racist. Right? And then they turned around and another group of development economists said, no, it's actually just the opposite. They were proponents of what they call dependency theory, that what happens with poor countries that are so dependent on rich countries for grants, those are the countries that actually stay undeveloped. So they create situations of dependency, and they continue in those situations and don't grow their own institutions. These sort of arguments went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I think the development economist that's, most influential and has done some great work is a guy named Daran Acemoglu from MIT. And he argues that it's the quality of institutions in a country that determine the future. So, for example, countries that keep wealth in a very tiny number of hands, don't build out a middle class, aren't inclusive, don't enforce the rule of law, so that, if you make a contract, you can count on it being enforced. The countries that have institutions that actually support relatively equal development and growth of all its people, they do better. The so-called extractive ones, the ones that take out, bribes and tribute, the ones that concentrate money in a very small number of hands, a lot of the poorer African countries, Latin American countries are like that. They're the ones who don't grow. I think that's probably the best thinking, that you have to have strong institutions, but the institutions have to be focused on letting everyone prosper.
If you look at where the resource-heavy economies, you have examples like countries like Qatar or United Arab Emirates who are dependent on the extractive economy, and wealth is concentrated in the hands of few royal families. But those countries have achieved a standard of living comparable to the Western countries. Whereas you have a similar country like Venezuela, where they sell oil and few politically powerful people dominate the income, but Venezuela has become poor. So what separates a country's destiny in terms of whether it's going to become Abu Dhabi or Venezuela?
In the case of Abu Dhabi, the population is relatively small and the oil resources are huge. Qatar, I think the population of Qatar is in the hundreds of thousands. So they have a very small Qatari population, and then there are a lot of guest workers. So the living situation for guest workers in Qatar has gotten a lot better, but it wasn't great for a long time. So if you have so much oil and a relatively small population, of course it's relatively easy to give everybody a higher standard of living. And yes, it's concentrated in the hands of the rulers, but the strategy of Abu Dhabi and Dubai has been to really think about life beyond oil. So, one of the things that they do very aggressively is to try to think, so, what if the oil stopped tomorrow? What would we do? What would the economy look like? So Dubai wanted to become a hub. They really built out the service industry in Dubai, and that's why they've done very well. Venezuela has been mismanaged for a very, very long time. And so, just simple things like their efficiency in extracting oil is very low compared to the Middle Eastern countries. Venezuela is a specific story. There's been a lot of very strong ideology ruling that country. The current leader suggests to people that he's in direct communication with the previous deceased leader. There are some, how should we say politely, some quirky things about that country. There's a long list of reasons why it hasn't done so well. Nigeria is another country. Nigeria has a lot of oil. But for example, gas flaring is terrible in Nigeria. In other words, they can't control all the natural gas, so they just burn it. They let it burn off. And also one of the things we did at the World Bank was we developed something called the Human Capital Index. And that Human Capital Index asks a simple question: how much have you invested in health and education? Have you improved health and education over the past 10, 20, 30 years? And Nigeria, even though it's an oil exporting country, was second from last in terms of its investment in human capital. So that's one of the theories that I think make a lot of sense. Some would say, well, it really depends on how much you invest in your people. We think that's true. I mean, the evidence suggests that the more you have improved your health outcomes and your educational outcomes over the past 20 years, the more likely it is that you would have grown economically. And of course, Korea did that as well or better than any country in the world. So if you look at the course of my life, born in 1959, we were living in the Sinchon area at the time, and I was going to preschool until I was about 4 years old, and then we came to the United States when I was 5. So about at that time, when I was just about getting ready to leave, Korea got its first World Bank loan. And then a few years after that, they got a second World Bank loan, and they were ridiculed by the World Bank staff because they asked for a loan for education. So the bank said to them, "What are you guys are crazy. You shouldn't get a loan for education. You should build roads and build, energy, resources. That's what you need." But they got one for education. So I think that was prescient, and that was also key to how Korea developed so quickly, because the education of their population in those times was, I think, absolutely the key for the growth and development of Korea.
Right now, the biggest wealth gap is not within a country, but it's between countries. So if you're born in one of the top 20 richest countries in the world, as Korean people have done, you've already won the lottery of life. As somebody who was directing World Bank, I'm sure you visited some of the poorest countries in the world. Would you agree with that statement? Like, would you rather be born a lower middle class person in rural America than be born a relatively wealthy upper middle class person in one of the poor countries in the world?
It's a great question. There's more mobility now. If you were an upper middle class person, well educated, and you were living in, say, Rwanda, a country that I know very, very well in Africa, you would have a lot of opportunities. You would have opportunities to go study abroad. You'd have an opportunity to learn multiple languages, including, of course, the native language, Kinyarwanda, and you would live fairly well. Rwanda is a very stable country. The leader been recognized as one of the most effective and competent of all the leaders. And so you would do okay. So if you were truly born into the upper middle class and you had access to education, your mobility would probably determine your fate.
But then your choice would be that you'd rather be an upper middle class person in Rwanda than a lower middle class African American in Mississippi.
I would say it's a close call.
I was born in 1981 in Korea, and one time I was traveling to Vietnam with my mother, and my mother kept saying that, "Oh, Vietnam, looks a lot like Korea when I was young. And a lot of elderly Korean people say that. So I actually pulled up some data about per capita GDP in Vietnam. And I was traveling to Vietnam back in 2014. Per capita GDP of Vietnam, which was about the same as per capita GDP in Korea when I was born. So in the 1980s, Korea was still, $1,500, $2,000 per year country. I guess because of that, the rhetoric that I heard a lot, and I'm sure you heard a lot back in school, was that for you to be happy, Korea needs to be a powerful country. Like if we become 강대국 and we obsessed about being 강대국, then your lives would improve. But if you look at the map of the world, there are many countries where the countries are very powerful militarily, politically, geopolitically, or economically, and where the citizens' lives have not improved much. Why does this happen?
This is a much bigger question. And the question really is it enough just to be wealthy? What does it take to be happy? I'm 64 now, and I don't remember a time when individual countries were in such turmoil in terms of the politics. The polarization of politics has become extremely difficult. And so you hear people in the United States saying, oh my God, it's just terrible to be living in the United States right now. There's an election coming up, and many, many people are saying, gosh, this is not the election that we wanted to see. We didn't want to see this kind of rematch. We thought a lot about that, the World Bank too. What does it mean to be a happy, healthy, thriving country where everyone feels that they have a chance? And unfortunately, there are not that many countries where you can say, wow, everything is working well in that particular country, including the richest countries. Right? Among all OECD countries, Korea is thought to have more cases of depression than any other. 37%. 37% of adults are thought to be depressed.
American writer Mark Manson came to Korea about 2 months ago, and he made a video called I Went to the Most Depressed Country in the World. And that video got so many views from Koreans, and so many journalists made scraps of that video and commented on it. I think got Koreans thinking about the high depression rate and the suicide rate. And this is kind of interesting because if you look at the GDP growth of a Korean society, it's gone like this.
Yeah.
But I think if you could gauge the social atmosphere of Korea in terms of positivity or negativity in some kind of way, I think Korea reached its peak happiness in somewhere in the mid-90s. And that's why Koreans have so many TV shows about the 90s. We had a series of TV drama called 응답하라, followed by a year. So there was like 응답하라 1994 and then 응답하라 1998.
I watched that.
Right?
Yeah, I watched that one. Yeah.
So
Replay in English, it was called Replay
1998.
Yeah. 1988 one was great, right?
Okay.
Because
you were here.
I was here, and so the best part of it was this was the only Korean music I knew, right? 조용필, they were. It was wonderful to see that, and also, but watching that, I do remember that that's sort of how most people lived. There was one of the families was living in a half basement, but I think remembered as a relatively happy time, a time of great change. I think you may be right.
And a lot of young people today, maybe because of this nostalgia, if you look at fashion, the hip part of the town where people in their late teens, early 20s hang out. One of the big fashion trends in the last few years was what they call Y2K fashion. So they dress in the clothes of the generation. Of course, reinterpretation of the clothes of the generation, probably in their mind lived a happier time.
Yeah.
And then Korean economy continued to grow. And then the other indicators that you were saying, that started to emerge, I think, in the mid-2000s when the birth rate started falling, the suicide rate started to increase, and depression started to increase. And this is so contrary to what we were made to believe in the 1980s, that if our country just got rich, all the problems would be solved.
Right. So I did my PhD dissertation research here in Korea, and I was here from 1984 to around 1988 off and on for maybe a couple of years. And so it was just at that time that it was around $2,000 GDP per capita.
I was in kindergarten.
Yeah. And, there was a lot of talk about 선진나라, right?
Right.
What does that mean to be a 선진나라, sort of an advanced country? And, people would comment on it all the time. Don't act like that. That's the behavior of a 후진나라, right? And so there was a very self-conscious kind of sense of what Korea needed to be considered a developed country. And then, of course, the Olympics happened in 1988. I was here for that. And there were signs everywhere, people saying, we can't do this, we can't do that. You couldn't find boshintang anymore, because they got rid of so many of them.
Right. I remember a famous story that my mom told me that because there were so many pickpockets in Korea back in the 1980s, especially along the Cheonggyecheon area, government put out an announcement that foreign tourists are coming, our national destiny at stake. Please do not pickpocket foreign tourists for the time period in which the Olympic is happening. And
Yes.
my mother claims that pickpockets actually did listen.
Yeah. Pickpockets are very obedient in
Patriotic.
Korea. Yeah, patriotic. So there was a lot of talk about that. Korea, when I was born, used to have 6 births per woman, right? In the 1950s and 60s, right?
Now it's at 10% of what it used to be.
Yeah. Less than 10%, right? Right now, the official figure is something like 0.7, right?
For the whole country.
For the whole country.
But Seoul is lower than the rest
Seoul
of the
is
country.
lower than the rest of the country. And so, the birth rate is so low. The conflict between the genders, at least in terms of the surveys that I've seen, is higher in Korea than anywhere else. The Korean women are becoming more liberal or progressive. Korean men are becoming more conservative. And the gap between the two is higher than in any OECD country. So there's lots of things going on here now that have made me very concerned. And again, so Korea has become a very wealthy country. The only one, it's very important that you said that, Seung-yeon, that it's the only one that really started off poor and got into the top 20, right? Other than city-states like Singapore. So Korea made all this incredible progress. And BTS is a household name, Blackpink, the movies, Minari, Gisaengchung, these movies are now... Everybody knows them. And the thought is that, man, Korea is just doing great, but lowest fertility rate. And that has huge economic implications. So the very high depression rate is another. So 37% of Korean adults are estimated, these are estimates from OECD, are estimated to suffer from depression, but about 2.5% to 3% get treatment. So if you look at just the number of antidepressant medications that are given per population, it's nowhere near the number of people who are actually depressed in this country. Loneliness, right? So in the 1970s, 0.6% of people in Korea lived in single-person households. Now, there's different data, but in 2022, 2023, anywhere from 30 to 40% of people live in single-person households. So, I first heard of the term 혼밥, right? And because so many people are eating alone, and restaurants now are catering to the people who are eating alone. And the Surgeon General of the United States, the top doctor in the United States, he's actually a friend of mine and was a student when I was teaching at medical school at Harvard. But Vivek says that if you answer that, yes, I am lonely on a questionnaire, the impact on your life expectancy is the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
So loneliness is actually a risk factor for dying premature. So
if you're in a happy family and you smoke 15 cigarettes a day, you'd live as long as somebody who is lonely
yes,
but smokes
but not
cigarette.
smoking. But not smoking. Yeah.
Wow.
So all of these factors together are extremely concerning. And of course, you have the suicide rate. Right? The suicide rate has been the highest in OECD. It might just have gone down to number 2, but over a 20-year period, it's been the highest in the OECD. And if you look at, within those numbers, what are the most concerning ones? If you look at suicide in teenagers in the United States, it's the 3rd or 4th leading cause of death, accidents being the most common one. But in teenagers, in 20-year-olds, and in 30-year-olds, in all those generations, suicide is a leading cause of death in Korea. The suicide rate for men in Korea is 2nd or 3rd in OECD, but for women, it's number 1 in OECD, and it's about 3 times higher than the OECD average. So women are much more successful at committing suicide. We know that depression and anxiety are the biggest dampers, the biggest hindrances to productivity in the workplace. So there's a thing in the United States they call presentism, where people are depressed or anxious. They go to work, they show up, but they're really not doing very much because they're suffering from these illnesses. Yeah. Now that I'm so seeped in all of this data about Korea and it's been so concerning, you walk around and you think, oh my gosh, this place is great. There's just so many interesting things going on. There's, all these such stars. Who would have ever thought that Korean football player would be the face of, Toomey?
Right.
Who would have thought that, but underneath all that are these just basic facts that I think are worrisome. I mean, there's a fundamental shift that we have to go through here, or else future economic development, in my view, is fundamentally challenged. I'll keep going. There's more data, right? So Pew Charitable Trust did a study on the extent to which people of a country are materialistic, who say that what I own, what I buy is important to me. Guess which country topped the list?
Korea?
Korea, right? Top the list.
So we're the most
materialistic country in the world. And who has the highest expenditure per capita on luxury goods? $325 per person per year, which is higher than the US at $280. China, where everyone thinks, oh, they're the highest spenders, $55 per person per year, right? So very materialistic. And, this is also a country full of very thoughtful Buddhist people, right? And who've told us for a long time that materialism is a great evil. There are all kinds of, philosophical traditions inside Korea that we can bring to the fore and say, hey, maybe we should stop this. People will say, why are you always saying such negative things? Why are you always bringing up these negative things? Look, I'm only bringing these things up because, I was in the job where we do exactly what you said. So, we try to think about what are the things that make countries happy and productive and make them competitive in the world. Right? These things that I just told you are all enormous drags on productivity.
Actually, I used to think that these problems were very particular to Korea. And then I started, reading articles about demographics from newspapers around the world. And what surprised me was that a lot of countries are being more and more like Korea. So you have birth rate falling in the UK, as you said, France. If you look at the trend, it's on the downward curve. US as well.
Keep going. China is below replacement. Their population fell for the first time. India also is below replacement. A couple decades ago was at 6 births per woman, and now they've just fallen to 2.0. So this is going to happen everywhere,
right?
And we used to call it in the United States the canary in the coal mine, right? They used to bring canaries, into coal mines because the canaries were very sensitive to carbon monoxide, and they would look at the cage, and if the bird was still living and chirping, everything would be fine. But if the bird died, they would get out of there, right? So Korea is the canary in the coal mine in the sense that so many countries are going to go through this. I mean, Indonesia has a high birth rate, Philippines has a high birth rate, but looking at what happened in India, this is coming everywhere. So Korea not only needs to do this to save itself, I think Korea can be an example for the entire rest of the world in terms of how do you face a demographic crisis like this and then utilize all the enormous creativity, enormous drive, the enormous conviction that the Korean people have shown and take care of this issue? What I'm really here to say is, hey, Koreans, we have been so innovative. We have been so hardworking. We have been so successful compared to all the rest of the world. I'm just here trying to put this issue in front of people. Let's put all our creativity and energy that we put into everything, kept innovating to get to Korea where it is right now. But right now, we have to turn our attention to these threats. These are fundamental threats.
오늘 전 세계은행 총재님인 김용 총재님과 함께 부자 나라와 가난한 나라를 가르는 결정적인 요인이 뭔지에 대한 얘기를 나눠봤습니다. 여기서 가장 중요한 것은 국민의 건강과 교육, 이 두 가지가 가장 중요하다는 얘기였던 것 같아요. 근데 우리나라는 옛날부터 교육에는 신경을 써왔는데 국민의 건강, 특히 육체적 건강이 아닌 마음의 건강에는 많이 신경을 못 썼던 것 같습니다. 우리가 어떤 나라의 국민의 30% 이상이 폐렴이라든지 물리적 질환을 겪고 있다라고 하면 그 나라가 앞으로 계속 잘 살 거라고 기대하기 어렵겠죠. 국민의 30% 이상이 정규적으로 우울감을 앓고 있는 나라도 저 나라가 앞으로 잘 되겠다라고 기대하기는 어려울 수 있을 것 같아요. 단지 이게 눈에 보이지 않기 때문에 우리는 문제라고 인지를 못하는 부분인 것 같아요. 우리가 교육에 투자한 만큼 이 국민의 정신적 건강에 앞으로 투자를 해서 이 문제를 우선적으로 고쳐야만 우리나라가 계속 번영하고 발전할 수 있다는 말이 저는 오늘 가장 와닿는 이야기였습니다. 오늘 조승연의 탐구생활은 여기서 마치도록 하고요. 다음번엔 더 재밌는 문화 역사 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.